I'm Michael Jordan, and I'm the Director of Marketing and Public Relations at Blount Mansion. We're the only National Historic Landmark in Knoxville, and we're the birthplace of Tennessee. And we like to say that we're the Constitution connection in Knoxville because William Blount was one of the signers of the U.S. Constitution. Today, there are just a handful of houses of Constitution signers that you can visit. That includes Mount Vernon, Montpelier, where James Madison lived, Alexander Hamilton's house, and Blount Mansion. And we're the only one it's not in the original 13 colonies. So this is a really special connection. We feel like if we're going to call ourselves the Constitution Connection when it's fun, we have to call ourselves that when it's dicey. And that's why we did an Impeachment 101 nonpartisan event in February. And it's why we're proud to bring back Stewart Harris, who is a professor of constitutional law at Lincoln Memorial University, and also now a Blount Mansion board member, to talk about the Electoral College right when it's on everyone's minds. And I'm joining you from Governor Blount's office. This desk is the desk that the Tennessee Constitution was signed on in 1796. And those documents went to Philadelphia, where the capital was. And when Congress finally decided to act, we became the 16th state in the Union. But while the past, and particularly the 18th century, can seem like a different universe to us, it's important to note that a lot of things haven't changed. 1796 was a bitterly contested presidential election. Half of the people in the country viewed things through one lens and saw one reality, and half saw it through another. And in fact, the very reason it took Tennessee several months to become a state is because Congress was debating whether or not they really wanted to add that many more new electors for one candidate or another. So we can take some comfort in knowing that just as Blount Mansion has been through pandemics before, and we've come through those fine, we can also take comfort in the fact that we've been through contested elections before. So we're really excited to partner with the Knoxville History Project. We're grateful for this opportunity. And I think Jack is now going to tell us some specific Knoxville connections to the Electoral College from the past. I always learn a lot when I attend Jack's talks, virtual or in person, and I can't wait to hear what he has to tell us. Jack?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michael. Appreciate it. Yes, as you mentioned, this I think it's apt to say that that's our Constitution connection. Knoxville is one of the very few cities in America that was founded, co-founded, I should say, by a signer of the U.S. Constitution, and it's relevant to talk about the Electoral College at this time. When this came up, I said we have to find some excuse to do that. Our mission is at the Knoxville History Project is to research and promote the history and culture of the city of Knoxville. And what does Knoxville have to do with the Electoral College? Well, as it happens, several things. One is the mere presence of William Blount, who was who was there, at least. Whether he debated vigorously or not, I'm not sure about the Electoral College proposal, which was an interesting new idea in Philadelphia in the 1780s, or not. He was there, approved of it, and signed it. The Electoral College is one of the most perplexing parts of the Constitution. We don't think about it much. In fact, throughout the 20th century, the winner of the popular vote was the same as the winner of the Electoral College vote, and it's kind of funny in a sad way, and to think about it, was when I was in college some time ago. The Electoral College was something that mainly history majors knew about, and they knew about the fact that there were a few kind of really weird elections in our past where there were, bizarre cases where a president who didn't have the most popular votes had the most electoral votes anyway and became president. And we would talk about it almost like you talk about using drawing blood with leeches or dunking witches or something. It was something bizarre that happened a long time ago, had nothing to do with our modern life. We used to talk about the Electoral College as just a formality, but we have learned in recent years, in the last 20 years, 2 of the last 5 elections before this one were elections in which the winner of the popular vote was not the one who won the presidency, and it was all because of the way the Electoral College is set up. What does this have to do with Knoxville? We can't claim it's all Knoxville's fault, but Knoxville does have some fingerprints on the Electoral College, and not just because William Blount lived here. Knoxville was the capital of the state for 19 years, and when we think about that, we ought to think about all the things that happen in a state capital. It's not just a matter of trivia that Knoxville was once capital. Things happened here that were important for the state and occasionally for the entire nation. One of these things was that we had, was where the electors met by the provisions of the Constitution. The electors meet in the state capitol typically, and they would meet here. So I believe that in 1796, 1800, 1804, and 1808, the electors from Tennessee met in Knoxville to see what they would report to the nation about how Tennessee had voted. So Knoxville had a hand in in certifying the elections of Jefferson and Madison in those early days. But also in 1804, something extra happened. Anybody that recalls the last year and all the suffrage discussion knows that every time you have a new amendment to the Constitution has to be approved by a 2/3 majority of all the states. So it was in Knoxville was the capital, and the only amendment that came to the fore when Knoxville was capital was the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. This was an amendment that you see the need for it hinted at in the musical Hamilton. Believe it or not, if you watch Hamilton, you'll see this discussion, this kind of resentment of the kind of the weird way that the country was set up vis-a-vis how presidents and vice presidents were elected, and this was all allegedly fixed in 1804 through an amendment, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. And the state legislature met here in Knoxville to ratify this amendment to the 12th Amendment, and discussed it for some weeks and ratified it in July of 1804, a very dramatic month in U.S. history, when the same month that Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton, in fact. But this amendment it lays out a lot of the details about how the Electoral College is supposed to work, and just kind of refines what the original founding fathers had said about this. But these decisions were made here in Knoxville, probably in the old courthouse that was here then. But anyway, we're here to explain it as someone who knows a lot more about it than I do, and that's Professor Stewart Harris. He's a professor at Lincoln Memorial University School of Law, teaches constitutional law, and he might have heard his name if you listen to public radio, because he has a really interesting show called Your Weekly Constitutional, a well-named show because it's every week, and it's a nice pun too. But it's on public radio nationwide, and it's on podcast too. There's several ways to pick it up. Here in Knoxville, one of the best ways is on WOT2 on Monday at 7, if I'm not mistaken. But he's also a member of the board of Blount Mansion, as Michael Jordan mentioned. But without further ado, I want to yield the floor to Professor Stewart Harris.
Thank you very much, Jack. It is an honor to be here with all of you. It's an honor to be associated with the Knoxville History Project. And of course, an honor to work with Blount Mansion, the only home of the signer of the Constitution outside those original 13 states. Our topic tonight is the Electoral College, and it's kind of a freaky thing, isn't it? I mean, for the most part, we go through our lives only dimly aware that it exists, and then every 4 years, it seems, we get very, very interested in it. And so let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Electoral College, where it came from, what it's for, and how it's changed over the years. Now, when the Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia in May of 1787, they had lots and lots of big issues on their table. And one of them was how they were going to select this brand new president of the United States. It was a very, very sensitive topic because, of course, the executive of any government is, well, that's where all the guns are. That's where all the power is. We wanted a president who was going to be powerful enough to do what presidents need to do, but not so powerful that he was going to be tyrannical. We took some comfort from the fact that George Washington was pretty much preordained to be our first president, but he wasn't going to live forever. So things like how we're going to select this president became very, very important to the conventioneers. Now, the original proposal that James Madison put in his famous Virginia plan actually had Congress selecting the president. But people objected to that. Well, first of all, why would that be the case? I suspect that James Madison had Congress selecting the president because that was similar to how Parliament selects a prime minister. And that's, of course, our constitutional heritage. But people immediately pointed out in Philadelphia that the selection process in Parliament was prone to corruption. and that the king would often bribe members of parliament to get them to vote the way he wanted them to vote and give him the prime minister that he wanted. So the potential for corruption was there. And also our government, unlike Britain's, had separation of powers. We had 3 different branches of government. We're the very first government in the world to actually separate the 3 fundamental powers of government: legislation in the Congress, executive power in the president, and the judicial power in the federal judiciary. And so people said, well, you know, if Congress is going to select the president, then that means they're going to pick people who are beholden to them. And if the president wants to be reelected, he's not really going to be co-equal with Congress. Now, is he? So then the idea for the Electoral College was born. James Wilson, who was often called one of the smartest people at the Constitutional Convention, right up there with Alexander Hamilton, and also the primary author of Article 3, which is what created the federal judiciary. James Wilson said, well, why don't we just have a special group of people who are selected by the states for one purpose only, and that is to elect our new president. And why don't we make sure that they can't be members of Congress, they can't hold any office in the government of the United States. So these people aren't going to be corrupted. These people aren't going to be part of the permanent government, so we won't violate separation of powers. And indeed, if they're selected by individual states at meetings in those individual states, well then, by golly, we won't even have them all together in one place, and they can't get together and form factions and interest groups and wheel and deal and again, be corrupted by this process. So that's why they came up with the idea of an electoral college. And without a great deal of debate, that's what they created. But there were problems right from the start. Jack already told you about the problem with the tie votes that happened in Congress. 1800, of course, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied for president. And even though everybody recognized that Jefferson was supposed to be the president, Aaron Burr did not concede. And it took 35 rounds of balloting in the House of Representatives before Jefferson was selected. And this created a lot of bad blood. It was Alexander Hamilton who actually brokered the deal to give Jefferson the presidency. And that was among the reasons several years later that Aaron Burr shot him dead. So the stakes have always been high when it comes to these issues. The 12th Amendment came in, as Jack said, and it fixed that problem. It prevented there being a tie because from that point forward, we vote separately. I should say the electors vote separately for president and vice president, so it's not possible to have a tie anymore. Well, there were still other problems with the Electoral College because the Constitution gives individual states pretty much free rein on how they're going to select those electors. It simply says the legislatures of each state shall prescribe the manner of the selection of these electors. Well, originally, those legislatures said, well, we're just going to keep this power ourselves. And so they would simply vote for a slate of electors that they would send to their state capital and supposedly to deliberate as a college. That is, they were actually going to go and talk to each other, and they were actually going to debate the candidates, and they were going to select the president according to their own judgment. Well, it didn't work very long because very quickly people started noticing, wait, if we do that, then we might pick this or that, send this or that many votes for that particular candidate or this many votes for that candidate. We're splitting our vote up. If we really want to be respected and powerful within this new national union of ours, then what we should do is pass a law within our state so that the winner takes all. Think about that. So a state like Virginia, instead of splitting its electoral votes among several candidates potentially, now has a law in place that says, no, all of our electors are going to vote for the same candidate. Well, as soon as one state did that, the other states decided they would do that as well. And now you no longer have a college of people who are going to come together and deliberate and make a reasoned choice. You've got a bunch of people that Alexander Hamilton called lackeys of the state legislature. So right from the get-go, there were problems with this whole idea of this independent deliberative body of electors. In fact, Hamilton and Madison were so upset by this that they actually were arguing that the Constitution needed to be amended And indeed, Alexander Hamilton had a proposed amendment to abolish or reform the Electoral College, but it stalled because he was dead. Yep, that's another consequence of that duel, is that Alexander Hamilton, with all of his remarkable ability and his persuasiveness and his oratorical skills, was not there to push forward an early amendment to change the Electoral College. Well, as time went on, we got used to it, and by and large, the college worked reasonably well until bad things started to happen again. And the first time they happened has another Tennessee connection, because it was the election of 1824, when our favorite son, Andrew Jackson, was up against a fellow named John Quincy Adams. Well, guess what? Andy got more votes, but John Quincy Adams ended up winning in the Electoral College. Not a good outcome for Tennessee, not a good outcome for the nation. People always sort of assumed that the electors would, broadly speaking, represent the will of the people, but they didn't that time. And then it happened again. It happened in 1876. I won't go into a lot of detail about this now. I'll simply say that there were a Democrat, Samuel Tilden, and a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes. This was the time in which the Democrats were the party of the South, the party pro-slavery. Slavery had been abolished, but there was still a lot of that sentiment in the Democratic Party. And certainly the Democratic Party after the Civil War was very eager to get rid of the federal troops that were enforcing Reconstruction. And so those were the great issues of the day, and it was an extremely hard-fought election. So hard-fought that several states, get this now, ended up sending not one, but 2 slates of electors to Washington, D.C. You heard me right. They actually, in some cases, formed separate governments that claimed to be the governing government in that state. And then they sent 2 slates of electors to Washington, D.C. to Congress to be counted. This created a crisis, and Congress was in an uproar. And what are we supposed to do? Congress is supposed to count the votes and certify a winner, but we don't even know which votes to consider legitimate. And so Congress did what Congress often does. It appointed a commission, and it included Republicans and Democrats and from both houses of Congress, and even some Supreme Court justices. But guess what? People got all upset about who was going to be on that commission too. And they couldn't come to a decision until, once again, as in the election of 1800, somebody brokered a deal. And the deal was this: Democrats would allow some of their electors to effectively change their votes and vote for Hayes, give him an electoral victory in exchange for Rutherford B. Hayes's promise to withdraw federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. And that was extremely consequential because, of course, as soon as the federal troops were withdrawn and Reconstruction was over, well, that's when Jim Crow began in earnest. And that led to close to 100 years of racial repression in the South, the legacy of which is still with us today. And that was because of what's arguably the most raucous dysfunction of the Electoral College. The next time was a little bit more obscure to most modern people. You've probably heard of Grover Cleveland as being the only 2-term president who had 2 non-consecutive terms. That's because between those 2 terms, he was beaten by a fellow called Benjamin Harrison. And Benjamin Harrison didn't have a majority in the, didn't have a popular majority, but he won in the Electoral College. So once again, the will of the people was thwarted, and the Electoral College went a different way. Perhaps a bit less consequential that time. We've kind of forgotten about those guys, haven't we? But nonetheless, it happened again. So as of the 19th century, as of the end of the 19th century, 3 times, 3 elections, the majority of Americans did not elect their president. And I'll agree with Jack. When I was growing up, it was a 19th century anomaly. You know, people would say, well, it's possible, but it's only happened a couple of times, and most people couldn't even remember when it happened. Well, I happened to be living in Florida in 2000, and I went to bed thinking we had a president named Al Gore, and I woke up the next day and not so fast. Indeed, I actually I went down and watched the recount in our local supervisor of elections office. Took my 2 sons with me at the time. They were 10 and 7 years old, and they didn't want to be there, and I don't think they even remember it, but by golly, they were. And they witnessed another election in our American history, where the popular vote winner, Al Gore, did not win the election. George W. Bush did, when the Supreme Court famously or infamously stepped in and stopped an ongoing recount in the state of Florida. Well, we thought maybe that was the last time for maybe another 100 years, but by golly, less than 20 years later, in 2016, same darn thing happened. Hillary Clinton had about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, and yet Trump took the Electoral College by razor-thin margins in a couple of Midwestern states. And so once again, we have a minority electing our president. Now, why do we get so offended by this when the founders clearly did not intend for a popular election to take place? Let's explore why they created a system where the majority could theoretically not rule. This is because they profoundly distrusted democracy. They called it mob rule, and they felt that people like themselves, basically white propertied men of education and what they called civic virtue, should be the people who ran the country. And at that time, of course, only such people could even vote, let alone be in office. And so it was natural for them not to trust people whom they considered to be the great unwashed, people who weren't necessarily literate, people who didn't have much education, people who they didn't trust to make decisions of this sort. And it was just one of many aspects of our republic where we didn't vote directly for things, but we vote for representatives who theoretically are going to be from a better class than the average person. So our Constitution was pretty darn anti-democratic. Even though there was an expectation that the majority would rule, they would do so indirectly through their representatives, and nobody expected direct votes by most people. Well, then things started happening, didn't they? After the Civil War, Black men got the vote. The 15th Amendment supposedly guaranteed that. Didn't work too well for about 100 years, but at least in theory, Black men are at it. 100 years ago, we finally add not a minority, but an oppressed majority of our fellow citizens when women finally got the vote. My wife often points out to me that they were the last one in line because Black men got it even before Black women or white women did. One other major change was later on when the vote was also extended to people who were 18 or older, and that was also done by a constitutional amendment. So those changes have taken place, and what they show is that over time, we have become a more democratic nation. We have become a nation where one person, one vote is what we expect. And so it sticks in our craw a little bit more, doesn't it? Whether we're Republicans or Democrats, it sticks in our craw to think that a minority is going to rule us rather than a majority, and that some of our votes are not going to count. In fact, here in Tennessee, I can tell you right now, your vote did not count. I don't care who you voted for, Trump or Biden, it did not count, or one of those libertarian guys or the Green Party or whoever, it did not count because it was a foregone conclusion that Trump would win all of the electoral votes in Tennessee. And that, again, offends a lot of people. I should say, same situation in California. It was going to be Biden. And so it didn't matter who you voted for in that state either. And so that's why I think people are increasingly concerned that we have a minority that's governing this country when we've come to expect that everybody above the age of 18 gets to vote and that the majority should rule. Let's talk about what is ahead for right now, how this process works in practice today. We've just had our election of 2020, and by all the projections, which in all likelihood will end up being fairly accurate, he earned about 5 million more votes in the popular vote than Donald Trump, and also won significantly more electoral votes by what apparently are increasing margins as the final votes are tallied. A couple of states are still out, but those margins seem to be growing. So, okay, this time it worked, supposedly. This time the majority did rule. But we still have several steps to go through. Between now and about a month from now, on December the 8th, the states have to certify their results, and there are papers to be signed and official seals to be attached and all of that. They certify who their electors are supposed to vote for. And then if by December the 8th, they send that certified list to Washington, D.C., then that list cannot really be challenged when it gets to Washington. It's a so-called safe harbor provision of the election vote counting act that was enacted after that Hayes-Tilden debacle in 1876. But they really have to get them done. Their final deadline for certifying their electoral votes is December the 14th. By that date, all the votes have to be sent to Washington, D.C. Now, if they're sent after the 8th but before the 14th, then in theory, Congress can scrutinize them and perhaps reject them, which may become very important here. Because you see, the new Congress is sworn in on January the 3rd, but the president's not going to be sworn in until January the 20th. And it's in between those two dates, on January the 6th, that the current vice president, a fellow by the name of Mike Pence, is going to actually open up those ballots and count them. And he's going to preside over a joint session of Congress, the Senate and the House. And those votes can be challenged. And Congress does have the power, within some limits, to reject some of those votes. And that could actually change the outcome of this election. Indeed, one way that you've probably heard about, it's been much in the news lately because apparently President Trump is trying to convince people to do this. Some state legislatures controlled by Republicans may simply vote to reject electoral votes for Biden. Example is my home state of Michigan. Republicans control the legislature. The governor is a Democrat. It's been a fixed battle there, hasn't it, for the last few months. Governor Whitmer is not exactly on Donald Trump's list of favorites. But what happens if the Secretary of State of Michigan, who works for Governor Whitmer, certifies that Joe Biden won, and apparently has by about 150,000 votes in Michigan, but then the Republican legislature, for whatever reason, says, we're going to exercise our constitutional power to change the way we send our electors, and we're going to send in a bunch of vote for Trump. Now, that one state wouldn't change the outcome, but if more than one state, say Pennsylvania and Michigan, or Pennsylvania and Arizona and Nevada, if they decided to do that, maybe Georgia, well then, you can actually have the outcome of the election changed right then and there as the votes are being tallied on January the 6th. Let's hope something like that doesn't happen, because we're right back in 1876 territory then. We're back with Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. But even assuming that the votes are, it would have to be something like that to potentially create a tie. And if there is a tie, because right now I think Biden and Harris have presumptively about 306 votes. So way above the 270 that they need. But if there were some shenanigans, and if somehow that resulted not in a victory for Trump, but in a tie between Biden and Trump, well then, by golly, the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives, which votes on a state-by-state basis, one vote per state. Currently, even though the Democrats have retained a slim majority in the House, a majority of the state delegations are controlled by Republicans. So if there is a tie, and it does go to the House, chances are there would be a Republican victory and Donald Trump would get a second term. Now, assuming none of that happens, and let's all hope that we don't enter into such a constitutional minefield, if in fact Biden is certified as the winner, as the president-elect by the Electoral College, if in fact Harris is selected as his vice president, well then they get inaugurated on January the 20th. But what happens if it doesn't? What happens if there is an ongoing battle in the House of Representatives? What happens if something else horrible happens, like one of the candidates, say Biden, he's getting kind of up there in years. What if he gets COVID? What if he dies? Well, if he dies after he's been certified as election, the 20th Amendment tells us that Harris gets sworn in. But what happens if he dies before he gets certified by the Electoral College? Again, we are in very murky territory. And if in some strange way, both Biden and Harris are still in limbo land and they haven't been declared victors, because there'd be a tie for Harris as well for the vice presidency, then what do? Well, say hello to President Pelosi, because the Presidential Succession Act, which was enacted for, among reasons, just for this precise circumstance, dictates that the next in line for the presidency, if both the president and vice president are not available, is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And you can be a Pelosi fan or you can hate her, but I think we can all agree that's not an ideal outcome. I mean, that's a person nobody voted for to be president, and that's just not the best solution to our situation. So those are all the things that could go wrong this time around, and let's just hope that they don't. Last point, what can we do about this? If you don't like the Electoral College, if you want to avoid these problems in the future, well, there are two possible ways to do that. One is a constitutional amendment, and ain't gonna happen. It would require 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress plus a 3/4 majority among the ratifying states to do that. And smaller states, small population like Montana, who have outsized power in the Electoral College, they're not going to give up that power. In fact, the Republican Party, by and large, is opposed to changing or abolishing the Electoral College. They've done pretty well, both in 2020 and 2016, so not going to happen. There is also a proposal, however, that's very constitutional, but does not require a constitutional amendment, and that is something called the National Popular Vote Movement. And in short and brief, that's a group of states that enter into agreements between the states. They're called compacts. These are authorized by the Constitution, though they do have to be approved by Congress. But if enough states get together and agree that each of those states will direct that its electoral votes will go to whomever wins the popular vote. Think about that a minute. Tennessee might vote for a Republican, but it might agree in advance that it's going to vote possibly for a Democrat if the Democrat comes out ahead in the popular vote. States can agree to do that, and states that represent 160 electoral votes have already signed on. But such an agreement would only go into effect when enough states representing 270 votes sign on. In fact, it's supposed to begin automatically as soon as that last state puts them over 270 electoral votes. And then effectively, the Electoral College would be gone because the national popular vote would determine the outcome of the election, even though it would technically happen through the Electoral College. One other proposal that's out there that's perhaps even simpler would be simply to increase the size of the House of Representatives. It hasn't increased since the 1920s, and that would, if it were increased by several hundred, and that sounds extreme, but quite frankly, if we wanted the same ratios of representation that we had back in the early days of the Republic, we would need about 6,500 members of Congress. But even if we got something much less than that, that would also tend to address the imbalance in power right now, because more populous states would have more representatives, and therefore their disadvantage in the Electoral College would be to some extent ameliorated. So that's an overview of the Electoral College, where it came from, why it was created, some of the problems over our history with it. And that brings us up to the present day. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jack, because guess what? There's another constitutional connection with the Electoral College that he wants to tell you about.
Yeah, thank you, Stewart. It's all very fascinating. I have lots of questions, but and I'm sure a lot of people out there do too. And we'll give everybody a chance to ask questions in just a little bit. But I want to mention that you mentioned that Tennessee has been connected to a couple of the dysfunctions of the Electoral College, including the 1824 one. Andrew Jackson was a well-known figure in Knoxville for many years in his early career. But in 1876, this is just after the Civil War, we have an election between the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Union war hero. He was a wounded general who's in combat in the Civil War. But he ran against Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, and Tilden actually gained more votes. Hayes got, I think, in the original balloting, one more vote. And there was a good deal of consternation about this in Washington. There was a lot of back and forth in Congress. We're here kind of perplexed now that there are still people doubting an election that happened 9 days ago. Well, 4 months after the election of 1876, 4 months went by before we knew who the president was. Fortunately, back then the inauguration day was on March 4th. So when they made a final compromise on March 3rd and called Hayes the president, even though he's a Republican, the Democrats agreed to do it with the idea that he would lift the Reconstruction policies, the military Reconstruction policies, which frankly seemed to be fading away to some extent anyway. I think there were only 2 or 3 states that still had real full tilt military Reconstruction. I think South Carolina and Louisiana, I believe. But this was a deal that Hayes made to be president. Basically, he had been a civil rights guy. He'd been an abolitionist before the war. He'd been a civil rights. He sided with the radical Republicans after the war in Congress. But he ended up having to make this kind of deal that he may or may not have known would lead to something like what we came to know as Jim Crow. But he one of his first jobs in the White House, and this, as I mentioned last week, and last week's program was all about presidential visits to Knoxville. The first official sitting president who came to Knoxville ever as president. We'd had Andrew Jackson had been here a couple times, just passing through, staying the night, but he didn't have a big to do about it. But was the first time a president came out in public and gave a big speech was Rutherford B. Hayes on Gay Street. He stood in front of the Lamar House. 8,000 to 10,000 people came out. A lot of them just proud to have a president here in town. But he was really trying to, I think in his mind, I think he was trying to reconnect the North and the South and saying, "I'm your president too." But he was here. Everybody was happy and proud of it, and he went on. And it was after that that the Black people of Tennessee and other parts of the South started noticing that there wasn't anybody watching the store anymore, and that they were kind of on their own in a way they had not been before. Of course, Tennessee didn't have to deal with federal Reconstruction so much anyway, because we had Governor Parson Brownlow, who for 4 years was, I think, fiercer and more effective, perhaps, than federal Reconstruction had been in other states. But anyway, this was, I just wanted to mention that our very first presidential visit was a guy who came here as a result of the most controversial presidential election up to that time, certainly. But I want to, Stewart, if you have anything else to add about the election of 1876 and the compromise of 1877, which came after it and actually gave us a titular, at least, president.
Nope, not really much to add, Jack, except well, thank you for, as you always do, teaching me something I didn't know. And that's a fascinating connection here with Knoxville. So thank you for that. Are we about ready to open up the floor to questions?
Yeah, I hope so. I did have one question, and one aspect of the Electoral College is that, I think you kind of touched on it, is that it's made up of not of proportional members from each state, but congressional representatives plus senators. Basically, those are the numbers of electors each state gets. Yeah. So that gives states with lesser populations more power than states per capita than states with greater populations. Is that not right?
Oh, absolutely. It's very much true. Think about this. The state of Wyoming has only 1 representative, okay, for the whole state. It has fewer representatives than it has senators. So it has 2 senators and 1 representative. And so it gets 3 electoral votes. And at first glance, you're thinking, well, that's appropriate. I mean, that's not that many votes. And, you know, they're a small state population-wise, so that's okay. But a state like California, though it gets lots more representatives, it still has only 2 senators. And so proportionately speaking, all of a sudden when you start thinking about the average voter in a place like Wyoming as opposed to an average voter in California, well, it's like 3 or 4 times as powerful for you to live in Wyoming in a presidential election as it is in California. That's really what it boils down to, is that our current system creates this inequality, and it's because every state has an equal representation in the Senate.
Yeah. I think the idea originally was to keep the few cities of the East Coast from dominating the whole rest of the country that they might not even know much about. Or at least that's what I think I remember a professor 40 years ago telling me, but that it does seem dysfunctional to me, at least in 2020.
It's all about power, as it often is.
Yeah.
If I'm recalling correctly, you may have heard of a fellow named Governor Morris. He was also at the Constitutional Convention. His name looks like Gouverneur Morris, but it was Governor Morris. And he's famous because he's the guy who actually wrote the preamble to the Constitution, "We, the people of the United States," et cetera, et cetera. He was actually the guy who drafted the final copy of the Constitution, and he drafted the preamble. But he was very much an East Coast guy. And when it came time to talk about admitting new states to the Union, I think at one point he proposed that they just shouldn't have any votes in Congress. So it's just going to be the original 13 and everybody else just has to follow along behind us. So, you know, that's kind of the attitudes that existed. And so it's very clear that the Senate, because it gives equal representation to geographic areas and it's not based on people, then it's an anti-democratic institution. And I think the question for us today is whether we're good with that or not. I mean, do we want to keep a system that's anti-democratic after all the changes that have happened in the ensuing 233 years? That's the question.
All right, speaking of questions, what questions are there out there?
Well, I see one looking at the chat from Stephanie, and she's saying, will the recent unanimous SCOTUS case, that Supreme Court of the United States, Chiafalo versus Washington, play any role next month? Yeah, very good question from you, Stephanie. That goes to the issue of the so-called faithless elector. What's to prevent somebody who is an elector? And that would feel kind of cool, wouldn't it? Hey, I'm an elector, you know? I mean, how many of us can say that we actually are a member of the Electoral College? Well, what happens if maybe I'm pledged to vote for Biden, but in the meantime, I change my mind? Maybe for perfectly legitimate reasons. And I decide I'm going to go up there and vote for Trump instead, or for the Libertarian candidate instead. Does that happen? Can it happen? Well, it has happened. It's happened a number of times, but not a very large number of times. And it's never changed the outcome of an election. Recently, in the 2016 election, both the states of Colorado and the state of Washington had so-called faithless electors. And both states had passed state laws that penalized that actually fined. I think in the state of Washington, it was a $1,000 fine. It went all the way to Supreme Court, and the electors claimed that based upon the original intent of the founders, who were actually creating a deliberative body, that they should be allowed to deliberate and vote their consciences. But remember, that's changed a lot, hasn't it? Ever since winner-take-all voting was brought in. And the Supreme Court, just this past July, decided those cases in favor of the states of Colorado and Washington and said no, states can enact laws that require electors to vote in a certain fashion. And I think something like 30 some odd states have done so. I checked just before I came here today. Tennessee does not penalize faithless electors, but some other states do. And I noticed that California actually says that they can be fined, it's either $1,000 or $10,000, a significant amount of money. But my favorite part of the California statute was they can be sent to prison for up to 3 years. Other states, I think the state of Maine actually says that if they go in there and try to cast a vote that's not consistent with what they promised, they'll be immediately dismissed and their vote will not be counted. And somebody else will come in and vote the way they're supposed to vote. So there are a variety of mechanisms that states can use to prevent faithless electors. And I suspect that that could be an issue this year. If somebody from one of those 30 some odd states that has such a provision tries to be a faithless elector, I predict in the long run, it will mean states that all states will be enacting statutes of this sort, maybe increasing the penalties that they impose. Okay, let's see here. There's some more questions. From Robert Wimbrow, who selects the Tennessee electors? Well, in our state, we have an election. And the popular vote, it's a winner-take-all state. And so all of our electoral votes this time, it's been a foregone conclusion, will go for Donald Trump. And that's because the Tennessee legislature has passed a law that says that's what's going to happen. Okay, let's take a look from Bob. Communication.
Who selects the individuals?
Oh, who selects the actual individuals? There's an actual slate of candidates that are put up by the parties. So for example, the Republican Party says, you know, Ted and Susie and Bill are going to be our electors. And so if you vote for Donald Trump, these are the people that we're going to send there. And Bob and Ted and Susie and all the other electors that are selected by the Republican Party are selected because of their party loyalty. And so that's the way you really control faithless electors, is you put people in there whom you trust to vote the way the party wants them to vote. Okay, from Bob, communications have drastically changed since the 12th Amendment. Information came by newspapers nationally and everybody was not able to read. With better communications, is the Electoral College less useful? Great question from Bob, and I think the answer is pretty clearly yes. Because remember, one of the original reasons that we had an Electoral College was because the founders, the framers of the Constitution, didn't trust regular people to make such a decision. And among the reasons they didn't trust them was because they simply didn't travel much. They didn't get out much. Most people, for much of our history, were born, lived, and died within 50 miles of their home. Think about that for a moment. Go back a couple of generations, and you can probably think of people who never left their home county. Well, that was definitely true back in the late 18th century. And the thought was, how can such people who don't necessarily get newspapers and who get their news late and second or third hand, how can they make informed decisions? Well, that's pretty much gone, isn't it? I mean, we've got a very high literacy rate in this country now. Lots and lots of people are very highly educated, and communications are virtually instantaneous. I mean, think about it. We're live now, and there could be people from all over the world on this call. Got a really good turnout tonight. By my count, it's about 75 people. And so, you know, some of those people might be tuning in. I think last time we did one of these, that we had some people from Canada and maybe from some other places as well. Do we have anybody from overseas here today? If you do, you can type it into the chat box or raise your hand and let us know. So yeah, it's a lot less useful today, lot less justified today than it was back in the day. Okay, from Penny. It seems to me that just as our founders created 3 branches of government to be a balance of power, that was their intent and created our voting system, albeit the Electoral College came later. The intent was to provide a bit more clarity and fairness. It seems the one system that has been rejected over and over and over was allowing the popular vote to decide. Yes, that's been rejected from day one. It's never happened, and you're absolutely right. The argument, one of the primary arguments in favor of the Electoral College is that it balances 2 things. It balances a popular vote through the House of Representatives and how they're incorporated in the Electoral College. It balances it with the rights of states, as governments, to participate in this process. And that was an extremely important compromise back in the day. In fact, the very constitution of Congress itself, the very composition of Congress, was the subject of what was called the Great Compromise. And some people wanted a Congress that was state by state, 1 vote per state. And other people said, no, it's got to be more representative. And the compromise was, we're going to have 2 houses of Congress. Well, from that point forward, we basically said, we're not going to be completely democratic, because everybody knew that Rhode Island, for example, didn't have as many people as Virginia. And therefore, Rhode Island was going to have a lot more power in Congress than it would otherwise have if things were completely representative. And the argument's always been that if we're completely representative, if everybody's vote counts equally within our major population centers, whether they're cities or whether they're entire states like California, well, they'll just dominate everything. Well, that's true. They will. But the counter to that is because that's where the people are. And do we really care, or should we, about, you know, a geographical line, a legal fiction that we call a state? And are we really giving votes to people, or are we giving votes to trees and rivers and streams or cows in the field? Why should people in one state have more power in their votes than people in another state? So those are the 2 arguments, basically, I think, most fundamentally. Okay, from Donna, and she says, from Terry. Okay, Terry and Donna, what is the role of the Supreme Court in deciding the outcome of an election? Great question. by and large, elections are left to the states under our Constitution. Remember, I told you that the Constitution says each state legislature shall determine the manner of selecting its electors. And that runs all throughout this process. Each state runs its own election in its own way. And so most of the challenges that you've been seeing in the newspapers lately are in state courts in various parts of the country. And if there's an outcome in one of those cases that one party wants to appeal, the appeal will go all the way up perhaps to the state Supreme Court, who will decide those state issues of electoral law. And in most cases, that's going to be the last word. However, there's something called a direct appeal from a state Supreme Court to the United States Supreme Court if, in addition to state issues, there are also federal issues in that case. And that's what happened with Bush versus Gore. The Florida Supreme Court had actually decided that the recount in 2000 should go forward. But then there was a direct appeal to the US Supreme Court, and the lawyers for George W. Bush argued that there were a couple of constitutional violations, mostly having to do with the Equal Protection Clause. I won't go into all the details here. And the US Supreme Court stepped in to what is almost always considered a pure issue of state law, and stopped the recount and effectively decided who would be the next president of the United States. That is probably one of the most criticized decisions in all of American constitutional law. And part of the criticism is that the US Supreme Court just stomped all over states' rights that day. Florida wanted to do the recount. Its government, its Supreme Court said, do the recount. And the US Supreme Court said, no, Florida, stop. That could happen again this year. I don't think it will. And the reason I don't think it will is this. In 2000, it all came down to Florida. Everybody knew that the electoral votes in that state were going to decide the election one way or the other. It was extremely consequential. And it was, well, here's a technical constitutional term. It was a hot mess. Okay, there were all sorts of different methods of voting and counting votes and archaic, computer punch card machines and all the rest of it. It was just a mess. This time, the election seems to have gone extremely smoothly. Very few problems. I think there was a broken pipe in one state house and they had to delay some vote counts until they fixed the broken pipe. That's the worst problem I've heard of. And also, one state is not going to determine the outcome here. In order to flip this election, Donald Trump would have to get at least 2 states, I think, maybe 3 to go his way. So between that, the fact that any one case in any one state is probably not going to change the outcome, and the fact, and this is a fact because we've heard it from all 50 states now, there is no credible evidence of any fraud in any of these elections. I doubt the Supreme Court would take an appeal from, for example, Pennsylvania, both because there's no evidence and because it wouldn't change anything even if it flipped. Okay, from Krista, she says, how likely is it that states could divide their electoral college votes like Nebraska and Maine? Wouldn't this be more representative, like proportional representation, so that it's not winner take all? You're exactly right, Krista. That would have to be a decision that the states make. And I imagine there are a number of states who are thinking in those terms, because although it doesn't amount to a direct election, and it could still lead to a minority candidate, controlling the White House, it would be much less likely, wouldn't it? I mean, think about Tennessee. If we had proportional voting, then Biden would have gotten a few votes, probably over near Memphis. And Trump would have gotten probably most of the remainder, but at least everybody, generally speaking, would have had a chance to weigh in on the election, and it would have been more representative. So maybe states will consider doing that in the future. All right, I think that's the last question I have on the chat room. Does anybody else just want to speak up and talk to me?
Can you explain again why you said that Tennessee was a foregone conclusion? I didn't get that.
We are a ruby red state, Paul.
I figured that out at least.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, is that the case for other states as well?
Absolutely. Tennessee may be the very reddest state in the union. It might be overtaken by Mississippi or Alabama or Texas, but we're right up there. And because of that, it's almost inconceivable that we would vote for a Democrat in a national election.
Well, it's, I have to say we did so as recently as 1996 when.
Yeah, but you and I both know, Jack, that there's been a major shift since then.
Yeah.
Back in the day, in fact, all the way back to the Civil War. Remember that Tilden-Hayes thing?
Yeah.
Hayes was a Republican, Tilden was a Democrat. For many years, the Democrats were the party of slavery, and then sort of the neo-Confederate, or the people who were trying to defend the interests of at least white people in the South. And they were the party of conservatism, especially when it comes to matters of race. That all started to change after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In fact, when Lyndon Johnson signed that act, he said, we're going to lose the South, the Democratic Party, for a generation. Well, he was right, but he was wrong. They lost the party for more than a generation. They lost the South for more than a generation. So starting in the 60s and accelerating and really to a tipping point in the 1980s under Reagan, people who were Democrats switched over to Republicans. And so even though there were some remnants of a Democratic Party structure and a few people occasionally in a southern state like Bill Clinton, if they come from the South, for example, or Jimmy Carter can occasionally, decades ago, could get it. But 1996 was 24 years ago. These days, right now, the Republicans have a lock on Tennessee, just as the Democrats have a supermajority in the state of California. So same thing there, foregone conclusion, it was going to be a Biden state.
What happens if there's several candidates and nobody gets 270?
Well, you have to get 270. So if there is not one candidate that actually has 270, that would also go to the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives would then have to resolve that issue.
It happened in 1824, right?
Yep, exactly right. Another interesting fact, some people are concerned about another potential outcome if the election results are still being contested as of January 20th. There's been some suggestion that Donald Trump might simply, grab onto the radiator and refuse to leave the White House. That can't happen legally because the Constitution is very explicit. His term ends at noon on January the 20th. He is no longer president. Now, he might still be contending that he should be the next president, that he was reelected, but until such time as that decision is final, Nancy Pelosi will be the acting president. So that term is over, as is Mike Pence's, at noon on January the 20th. What would happen if he didn't leave? People are always curious about this. Right now, it looks like it's a pretty clear victory for Joe Biden, and the majorities are growing in all the contested states. I think in that circumstance, the two government entities that are most important to making sure we have a peaceful transition would be the Secret Service, who's directly in contact with the president, and heaven forbid, the military, which is sworn to uphold the Constitution, not the president. I happen to have graduated from the same ROTC program that Mark Milley did. He was 3 years ahead of me at Princeton. I didn't know him personally. He was the commander of the whole cadre, and I was just a brand new member. But I do know that they taught us there that the military is subordinate to the civilian authority, and we have no role in elections. So the worst case is that we have an indeterminate outcome, that our current president tries to stay in office, and then the people with guns have to make a decision as to whether they will uphold their oath or whether they will side with Trump. And by the way, I hate to talk about violence, but think about it. That's why we have a constitution. We have something called the rule of law. And perhaps the most fundamental duty in a constitutional like ours, that is basically a majoritarian rule, is that sometimes you lose, and when you lose, you got to admit it, and you got to go if you're not reelected to office. And the alternative to the rule of law is, sadly, and it has been throughout human history, is violence. So that's the absolute worst case I can imagine. Okay, I'm taking a look here at some questions that have popped up on the chat board. Penny says, doesn't one congressional body decide on president and another decide on vice president so that we could end a mix under some circumstances? Yes, you're drilling down here, Penny. It's the House of Representatives voting by state that would decide a contested presidential election. It's the Senate, which of course also votes by proportionately 2 votes per state, that would decide if there's a tie in the vice presidential election. So yeah, I mean, we could have, I guess, President Biden with Vice President Pence, or the other way around, Trump with Vice President Harris. That would be an interesting combination. Think about it. Thomas Jefferson was John Adams's vice president back when we had, you know, the potential of a tie in the Electoral College, because the electors, more of a potential, I should say, for a particular office, because they didn't vote separately for president and vice president. And we had John Adams, a Federalist, and a fellow who had previously been his friend, but was now his political arch nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, as his vice president. So we've been down that road. Didn't work well then, wouldn't work well now, but I hope it's a remote possibility. Liz says, excellent explanation. Thank you, Liz. You and my mom both like the way I explain things. No easy solution. Would take a lot of political will to change it. You got that right, Liz. It's been proposed. It almost happened as recently as 1969. Believe it or not, Richard Nixon actually supported some pretty significant changes to the Electoral College. But there was a filibuster in the Senate. Southern senators didn't like the idea of abolishing the Electoral College, and so they filibustered it to death, and it died in 1969. Jimmy Carter proposed something that went nowhere, like most things he did with Congress. Great man, not a very effective president, I'm afraid. So people have been talking about this periodically throughout our history, but every single time it's fizzled along the way.
I think so, Professor Harris. We really appreciate your being there in that historic place for us at Blount Mansion, and we appreciate the partnership with Blount Mansion on this this fascinating evening. There aren't many opportunities for history people to seem so relevant, so we take these opportunities as they come. But I thank everybody for coming, and I thank again Stewart Harris, and tune into his great show, your weekly constitutional. WOT2 on Mondays. So yeah.